for me, the energy transition began when I was a kid. I grew up in a household with 3 sisters and me. We had a wood stove, and my job was to stoke the stove, at least in my sister's eyes, and so it was. And it was a fun job, but I, like any kid, wanted to do other things. So I remember looking at solar hot water systems and like Popular Mechanics and magazines and saying, hey, maybe we could get this, and I wouldn't have to stoke the stove. We could fill up the radiant heat with hot water from the sun. And with a little bit of 7th grade math and help of the local sales guy, I convinced my parents, let's get solar hot water. And pretty much done with the stoking of the stove. It's like, hey, this renewable thing's really good. And ever since then, I kind of set my eyes on energy and now the energy transition. So realizing this is kind of, for me, a dream come true, and we're fast on its way. I want to just prime this event with a little bit of what I see going on at a macro level and what's happening. And kind of as an economic lens, looking into the future, things are a lot different. The next slide here is talking about what's happened over the last 7 decades, from 1960 through 2020. And what you see is, in purple, is electric load growth in percent and real economic growth in green. And the gray line is the ratio of those. So we had a 2-to-1 ratio from 1960 to 1970 in terms of economic growth to load growth. So, yeah, electric growth to load growth. 2-to-1 electricity to economics in terms of percent change. And then it's had this trend line going down right up through 2020. Perfect time to invest. Look at that trend line. What a moving average. No. You know, we had negative load growth, minus 0.1% for the last decade. Not exactly the most sanguine opportunities by the moving average, but things are changing. We're facing massive structural change in terms of energy supply, with thermal being retired and being replaced by renewables and storage. But we're also facing change in terms of demand growth. We have the conversion of fossil to electrification, transportation, buildings, and industrial processes. Combined, we have a lot of load growth. So we're looking at about 40% load growth over the next decade. It's a lot better than minus 0.1%. And the ratio is flipping. We have now roughly, back what we had in the 60s, 2-to-1 electric load growth to economic growth. That's something to get excited about. And I think it's a lot more than we're used to, and a lot more than we've ever conceived. So how this works out is it's about 5.5% annual electric load growth. It consists of about 1.7, if you're to add in, it's not really load growth, but it's, in terms of structural change, it's a capital replacement of coal generation principally with renewables and storage. That's a lot right there, 1.7 per year. Then we add in 1.5% for growth, largely around data centers, but also onshoring. Things are happening in the US again, in manufacturing. But AI, that's a big driver. And these new data centers, they're going from roughly 100 megawatts to 600 to 1,000 megawatts. That's a big difference, and another source of load growth. And then finally, the electrification of everything. And that's a key source of load growth at 2.4%. So there's a lot of opportunity. And the question then becomes, how do we get there? Well, one of the things that's driving this opportunity at a fundamental level is AI. And it's such a big driver, a little bit unknown. It's hit us so fast. We have to kind of hold on and understand this a little better. So if we have traditional linear processing of computes, that's flatlined. So the only way to get more power out of a compute is to just consume more electricity. More electrons are going through the chips. And if you look at from 2022 to 2025, we're looking at about a 75% increase in compute. You can see the CPUs are about 270 watts, and they go to 500 watts. And the GPUs from NVIDIA are at 300, and they go into 500 watts. That's a lot more compute power and a lot more intensity, and there's a lot of demand for it. And this is major driver. That too is structural change, AI. Well, that's the demand side. So what about the supply side? How does this sit? How are we going to realize this? Well, the cartoon says it all. It's a tight squeeze. We have a lot in the queue, but it's a tough system to get through. Really tough. And it's long, it's cumbersome, and it's used to minus 0.1% electricity load growth, not 5.5% effectively. It's a big difference. And it's going to be tough to overcome. There's going to be a pinch. There's no doubt about it. So in order to get there, certainly we all know there's going to be large reform and interconnection queue process needed. May happen, may not. I think you'll hear from Mark Gabriel in just a few minutes on localized, hyper-localized production, and that's something that is a pathway forward. And finally, I think we're going to be pinched enough that thermal generation is going to stay on longer and doing more because there's just more demand than we have. By the way, there's plenty of seats up front. I shouldn't say plenty. There are seats up front. All right. Part of this realizing the transition is the acknowledgement that we have to go 24/7 green. And there's been a lot done in terms of technological advancements, particularly battery storage, to get us there. But how do we get there, and how do we give storage some respect, at least some environmental respect? This is earlier this week in California. You can see renewables are the green line, renewable production's at around 14 gigawatts, and we have thermal online at about 8 gigawatts, and ramping up in the evening to meet that sunset when renewables drop off pretty precipitously. During that same time, we're running about 8 gigawatts of thermal at kind of its minimum load level to meet the evening ramp. We're curtailing about 2 gigawatts of renewables. So we have a relatively constrained supply stack. It's just not flexible, the thermal, enough to enable that renewable to get to the system. It's not a deliverability issue. It's just we have too much energy on the system, so it gets curtailed. The evening ramp, you might notice on the graph to the upper right, 15,000 megawatts in 3 hours. That's a big ramp. But if you look at the storage, it stepped in and charged at 4,000 megawatts, or 4 gigawatts, and discharged at another 4 gigawatts, so a delta of 8. So that would have been 23,000 megawatts would have been the ramp, were it not for storage. That's a big benefit right there. It saved a lot of thermal running middle of the day, and then those startups for the evening ramp. So it's really contributing significantly. So how do we take this and put it in environmental context? Well, this is for 2030. It's for a California entity. It's actually a CCA. And like a lot of entities, they're long when the sun's up. That's the green. And they're short when the sun's down. That's the red. That's the upper diagram. So that's the position. So they bought a lot of solar, and they're long. Over the course of the year, net zero. But on an hourly basis, it's not close. So on an emissions basis, yeah, they're net zero, but they've only covered about 2/3 of their real emissions. That's something to cover. So how do we do this? Well, in this case, we looked at the shadow price of production for reducing carbon, and we have those hourly values. You can see in the ramp hours in the early evening, it's about $20 a megawatt hour. And middle of the day, it's about $2 a megawatt hour. So we have roughly an $18 environmental spread between charging when the sun's up and discharging when the sun sets. Well, that's an environmental benefit storage could get, and does get, but it doesn't receive the credit yet. I wanted to cartoon this out in terms of the lens that's commonly looked at, which is annual REX, which is kind of Mr. Magoo at the base of the diagram, going down the yellow brick road, trying to get towards the Emerald City. Well, he's looking with his with his myopia, and he doesn't see the sharks. And treading towards that Emerald City, he's going to get eaten by sharks versus Mr. Swift looking through that high-powered, like Ascend analytic lens at hourly attributes, maybe even based on sub-hourly attributes of what's ahead. And it is ahead. Hourly attributes are here today in kind of early growth. 2025, World Resource Institute will codify the standards, but they're going to be hourly. And making an irreversible investment decision, not being cognizant of the hourly attributes, you're going to get eaten by sharks, because the value of the solar when the sun's up on an hourly basis is worth a lot less than you think it is. And that's the point. So let's, as in the Wizard of Oz, peel back the curtain, see how this works. This is LA. We're looking at the hourly emissions in pounds per megawatt on an hourly basis for 2030. And we do this historically. Obviously, you can look at that on a locational basis. So LA. And what you see is the emissions are less when the sun is up than when the sun's down, the emission intensity. And there's a pretty big delta. Relative to the hub, it's red. LA has a positive basis or pollutes more per megawatt at that load consumption point than the hub, SB15. Now let's take the same concept and look at this out at Blythe Node on the Arizona border. It's a little different. There's no load there. There's a lot of production. So when the sun's up, its environmental attributes are well, as green as could be, and a pretty negative basis in terms of emissions to the hub. When the sun's down, it's a little better than LA, but not much. So it's a pretty good delta there. If we look at this, it says there's real environmental benefits to storage. It's worth something. Well, we saw it could save wrecks, like at this very moment. That's worth something. And here's how you account for it, by looking at the hourly attributes on a location basis for emissions. And this is just showing it, Blythe Node relative to the hub. It's a little less, but particularly less when the sun's up. A lot of excess there. A lot of solar, not much load. So let's put this all together. And we have megawatt hours when we're charging and discharging. And then we have the pounds per megawatt of charge and discharge. And we get a total benefit of CO2 reductions of 45,000 roughly tons per year in 2030. An environmental benefit of about $7 million at $150 a ton in 2030. So storage is producing something in terms of an environmental benefit. Right now, it's not considered to do that, but it is. It's realizing a material environmental benefit. We can look at the same thing out at Blythe Node. And it's roughly the same. It's a little bit better, 7.2 in terms of value, a little bit more tons. All right, let's put this all together and look at solar at LA, Blythe Node, in the hub, and storage. And what we find is 100 megawatts of solar out at Blythe Node is about that same 50,000 tons per year as the storage. 100 megawatts of solar at Blythe equals 100 megawatts of storage in terms of environmental benefits. That's not accounted for today. That's interesting. So there's real value there. And then the BESS system out at LA, there's really no locational differences. As I said, it's pretty much the same. But solar, if you were fortunate enough to be able to site 100 megawatt solar in LA, yes, that has about 85,000 tons of reduction benefit. So significant locational attributes. That's what we need to be looking at, locational benefits of carbon, and more importantly, the time benefits of emissions. That's where the future is. And what we do is we take all this information in terms of pounds per megawatt generated at each location, and we're solving for this to minimize cost to serve a load and emissions jointly. And that's done through our automatic resource selection process software. It does co-optimization between, well, economic value of energy arbitrage and energy production and emissions. And we can now look into the future and say, hey, we can be like Mr. Swift and reach the Emerald City instead of, well, walking blithely along and getting eaten by sharks.